Scholar and commentator who writes and speaks about issues of race and ethnicity. He is the author of Visible Differences: Why Race Will Matter to Americans in the 21st Century. And most recently, the author of Sharing the Dream: White Males in Multicultural America. Dominic is a native of Wisconsin, so he's visiting the big city here to come to Boston College and be with us. He's very welcome here. Tonight he will speak to us on the topic, Keeping the Faith: Race, Multiculturalism, and the Changing Face of Catholic America. We welcome to our campus Mr. Dominic Polera.
Thank you, Father Himes, for a very kind and gracious introduction. I'm going to speak for about 35 or 40 minutes, and then I'd like to hear what you have to say, your thoughts, your views, your perspectives, and if you have any, your questions. I'd like to start with a vignette from Los Angeles, a priest from Los Angeles. When I interviewed him in 2003, Father Colum Rafferty was the pastor of St. Columban Filipino Church in the historic Filipino town section of Los Angeles. Rafferty grew up in County Derry in Northern Ireland, and he was ordained in 1953. He has spent virtually all of his time either in the United States or the Philippines. The 70-something pastor of St. Columbine in Los Angeles began to minister to the Filipinos in the City of Angels in 1996 after he came back from being in the Philippines for a long time. And it was while he was in the Philippines that he learned to speak fluent Tagalog. Rafferty's detailed knowledge of the nuances of Filipino culture and the Tagalog language endear him to the 800 or so parishioners of St. Columban Church in Los Angeles. In addition, Rafferty often speaks at Filipino parishes in and around Los Angeles. Filipino Americans are often surprised to see and hear an Irishman speaking Tagalog with ease. In response, Father Rafferty will often ask them in Tagalog, "Why are you surprised?" Through his ministry to Filipinos and Filipino Americans, Father Rafferty is breaking down barriers. He's shattering ethnic and cultural stereotypes in Greater Los Angeles. Now, I would argue that the Church, Catholic Church, continues to prosper in Filipino America, in part because of the presence of enthusiastic and dedicated priests like Father Rafferty, who reach out to their parishioners in a culturally sensitive fashion and who involve the lay people in their parishes to the extent that the people in the parish feel a close connection to the Church. The United States is presently undergoing a demographic transformation unlike any other in its history. We are shifting from what was once a predominantly white country to one where people of color are increasingly numerous and consequently more visible. Every year, the percentage of whites in the American population declines slightly. As a result, race affects the lives of Americans more and more than it used to. More Americans than ever before are affected by race, including people in communities that were once predominantly white. The collective face of America, then, is changing. This is true in the Catholic Church as it is in virtually all of our institutions. Roman Catholicism and Sunni Islam are the world's most racially and ethnically diverse religious denominations. There are an estimated 1.12 billion Catholics in the world. Of these, you find the largest share, 43%, in Latin America, followed by Europe with 25%, Africa with 13%, Asia with 11%, North America with 7%, and Oceania with 0.8%. The United States is home to the world's fourth largest Catholic population after Brazil, Mexico, and the Philippines. 22% of Americans currently identify as Catholic. American Catholics constitute a minority in what continues to be a majority Protestant nation, but they face little discrimination on the basis of religion anymore. The U.S. Catholic population is presently 64% white, 29% Latino, 3% African American, 3% Asian American, and 2% other. Issues related to integration and assimilation have always been part of the dialogue in Catholic America. A century ago, Poles, Germans, Italians, and others criticized the church at times for being insufficiently attentive to their needs. Now, at the same time, the immigrants then often were very happy with the church, but sometimes they weren't. Now, as we look at this topic of how race and multiculturalism are changing the face of the American church, one question we have is, what kind of evidence do we have to support, certain assertions? And it's difficult to come up with quantitative evidence on this topic, because without conducting an opinion poll in, say, a particular parish, we don't know with any kind of precision how people feel per se. We have to rely on anecdotes and other expressions of how people are reacting to life in their parish. So many observers, including myself, rely on anecdotes and field research to draw conclusions on this topic. And whenever you have a diverse, multifaceted, dynamic body like the American Catholic Church, it's very difficult to make many generalizations. So I'll try to avoid those as well. In terms of looking at how the American Church is part of our society, every year Catholic America, just like the United States as a whole, is becoming more ethnically and racially heterogeneous. In large part, in fact, because there are many Catholic immigrants coming to this country from Latin America and the Philippines. At the same time, the ranks of the diocesan priests and the church leadership continue to be primarily white. The Catholic leadership in the United States, which is heavily Irish today, heavily Irish American, as a reflection of the tremendously important role that Irish Americans have played in the church over the years, consistently offers rhetorical support for the needs of immigrants and ethnic minorities. And it espouses positions on social welfare issues that often resonate with immigrants and people of color. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, for instance, has a secretariat for Hispanic affairs and a secretariat for African American Catholics. Moreover, the organizational structures of many dioceses and archdioceses include offices for specific ethnic and racial groups. For instance, one of the most immigrant-friendly dioceses in the country, and in large part because there are so many immigrants there, is the Diocese of Brooklyn, where there are 24 ethnic apostolates. The Archdiocese of Galveston-Houston has 9 ethnic offices, including ones for African Americans, Hispanics, people of Polish descent, Nigerians, and Vietnamese. U.S. church leaders often speak 2 languages, particularly English, of course, and Spanish. The issues related to ethnic outreach, of course, differ from parish to parish and from diocese to diocese. This topic implicates race in part because of the current demographics of the priesthood. Most American priests today, I don't have any exact numbers, but most American priests today continue to be white or Anglo. Some Anglo priests minister to homogeneous, all-minority parishes with few, if any, ethnic tensions. Other white ecclesiastics minister to parishes where one group, such as Latinos, predominates, but there are ethnic frictions within the parish. And then there are Anglo priests who minister to fractious, multi-ethnic, and multilingual congregations. Of course, white ecclesiastics differ dramatically in terms of how they react to demographic changes. Some white men in the church actively seek multi-ethnic parishes. That's where they want to be. They would have no other parish. Others enthusiastically embrace a changing parish or a new assignment to such a parish. Some white pastors, though, do not want to conduct pastoral outreach to immigrants and people of color, but are forced to do so because of demographic change. Still others are receptive to doing ethnic outreach, but fear they do not have the requisite cultural and linguistic skills to be effective in this type of ministry. In any event, there is probably no other institution in American society where so many white men spend so much of their time working with and on behalf of immigrants and people of color. Father Edward Petkin, the pastor of St. Polycarp Catholic Church in Stanton, California, offers many insights regarding the complexities of ministering to diverse groups of Catholics. St. Polycarp, after all, is 60% Latino, 20% Anglo, 10 to 15% Vietnamese, and 5% Filipino. There are three main language groups in this parish: Spanish, English, and Vietnamese. The Filipinos speak English. Father Petkin goes by multiple names: Cha Ed, which is Vietnamese, Father Ed, which is English, and Padre Eduardo, which is Spanish. He notes that white ecclesiastics, such as himself, use signs, words, and symbols to convey their feelings of love and support for parishioners of color, and white parishioners as well. Petkin, a Spanish speaker, also describes the ethnic divisions that can develop in demographically changing parishes. For instance, in his opinion, us against them dichotomies are more likely to be found in parishes with two distinct ethnic or racial groups, as opposed to those with, say, 3 or 4 mutually exclusive groups. Anglo parishioners, moreover, typically react to an influx of Catholics of color in one of 3 ways: by leaving the parish, by complaining about the newcomers but remaining in the parish, or by adapting to the new cultural and linguistic dynamics that come to the fore. The current shortage of priests here in the United States further complicates considerations of ethnic outreach and demographic change within the U.S. Catholic Church. Catholic priests, notes one observer, are in short supply around the country, especially those with specialized language skills or certain ethnic backgrounds. For instance, Polish-speaking priests are in big demand in Chicago, and Portuguese-speaking clergy are in big demand in New Jersey. Spanish-speaking priests, and Latino priests in particular, are especially needed throughout the United States. It is a matter of debate within the church as to whether a white ecclesiastic can be completely effective in his ministry if he does not share the ethnic background or speak the ancestral language of a particular ethnic group. Vietnamese Americans stand out among communities of color in America, in multicultural America, because the supply of Vietnamese American clergy is such that Vietnamese Americans are usually ministered to by their co-ethnics, not by white ecclesiastics. In any event, in many, if not most, of our largest cities, the Catholic population in those cities and in the surrounding suburbs is growing rapidly. In some places, it's growing really dramatically. One such example would be Houston. In 1960, Catholics accounted for 6% of Houstonians. The most recent estimates put the percentage at 45%. And recently, in recognition of these dynamics, the Diocese of Galveston-Houston was made into an archdiocese. In other cases, where you're not having the dramatic growth in the number of Catholics, you might see the Catholic population remaining fairly constant, but the internal demographics of that population are changing. In other words, if you're having white flight and you're having immigrants move in, the number of Catholics may stay constant, it may increase a little bit, But that relative constancy masks a demographic shift that might be going on in that particular context. For instance, the Poles of Chicago constitute a major part of the Catholic population in the Archdiocese of Chicago. Now, some of them would be fourth-generation Polish Americans whose ancestors came here in the 19th century. Others may be immigrant Poles who arrived here 5 years ago. In terms of looking at the role of the Catholic Church in the community, not just in the Catholic community, but in the community proper, there are some examples where the Church is reaching out to people from different backgrounds, many of whom happen to be people of color. An example that many of us are familiar with is that of parochial schools, the Catholic schools. In many of our nation's cities, the percentage of students in parochial schools who are not Catholic, that percentage is quite large. And many of those students are students of color. Some cities, some dioceses and archdioceses have established programs to try to bridge racial gaps. One such instance is the Church in the City initiative in Cleveland, which partners inner city parishes with suburban parishes, and there's equal decision making. In other words, both sides learn from each other and gain from each other. Neither side is favored over the other. And these kinds of partnerships in Cleveland, for instance, have contributed to positive race relations. Another example of how the church is changing in terms of immigration is something that's not completely solely about the United States, but it relates to the Scalabrini Fathers. They're a group of gentlemen who minister traditionally to Italian immigrants. But in recent years, they have expanded their focus to immigrants in general. So in many of the traditionally Italian American parishes, you may have a Scalabrini Father who now ministers more so to the Spanish-speaking or other groups. One Chicago area Scalabrini priest from Italy goes by 3 different names. Like his voicemail, for instance, he has 3 different names. If you press the English language button, he's Father Louis. If you press the Spanish language button on your phone, he's Padre Luis. And if you're an Italian speaker, he's Padre Luigi. Now, as we look at multicultural parish life today, of course, for the typical Catholic, the church is your parish. And there are many parish communities that are in reality segregated by language and culture. As one priest said it to me, referring to his parish, which has some ethnic frictions, but people are getting along, but there are some tensions. He referred to his community as essentially several churches or several parishes that meet in the same building under the same roof. Also, even today, there are still some predominantly white parishes with interethnic tensions among white people. I know of a parish on New York's Long Island where 60% of the parishioners are Italian Americans. 45 years ago, there were relatively few Italian Americans there. It was, I think, mainly Irish. And what happened was, because of migration patterns out to Long Island, you had more Italian Americans. And as you might expect, with the increasing number of Italian Americans, they've become more visible in parish life. Many people there have a devotion to Padre Pio, an Italian saint. And one Irish American recently complained to the pastor, who himself is of Irish and Italian ancestry, about what he described as the, quote, Guineaization of the parish. And when we talk about these interethnic issues, between different groups, like within the white population, for instance, it's also the case you may have a parish that's heavily Mexican American, or with many Mexican immigrants. And in some cases, people from different regions of Mexico may bring some suspicions and antipathies from their native land to the parish. So there might be some subtle divisions, not big ones, but subtle divisions between people from this state or that state, Mexican states I'm talking about. And sometimes Mexicans and Salvadorans, for instance, might be in a parish together, and to the outside observer, everyone might seem like, have a Spanish surname, and some people would assume that everyone sees the world the same way, but there might be some distinctions within the parish between those who are Mexican and those who are Salvadoran that people make themselves. Also, and this is really on the cutting edge, some parishes, some Catholic parishes, don't have many white people at all, but there are interesting dynamics between, say, African Americans and Latinos. I know of a church in Los Angeles. It's 75% Latino and 20% African American. It was a traditionally African American parish. What has happened is with the influx of Latino immigrants, there have been some new dynamics. African Americans continue to contribute much of the money to the parish. And as a consequence of that, they have a sense of ownership. And sometimes there are some complaints. Like, for instance, and this is very basic, but this happens. Some of the African American parishioners might not be happy about how some of the Latino parishioners drive into and out of the parking lot for services. And when we have this vibrant immigrant population and increasing numbers of people of color and white immigrants as well coming into the church, the whole idea of syncretic notions of Catholicism, in other words, where people bring traditions from different parts of the world to their Catholic parish, it becomes ever more important. And I'm not someone who can answer this question, but you raise questions like, in other words, when does, if you're incorporating the national traditions of people from different countries, like for instance, when, if at all, does a Catholic ritual, for instance, stop being Catholic? And these issues come into play when one considers the faith practices of immigrants and their descendants. One example that I can cite that has played out over the years involves people of Italian descent. When the Italian immigrants, I'm partially Italian, when the Italian immigrants came to this country, many of them were from the south of Italy, and their faith practices were viewed by some people as retaining too much of what they saw as pre-Christian pagan practices. Southern Italians are very focused on patron saints, processions, things like that, and that initially didn't resonate with everyone in the American church. You fast forward 100 years, and many of those practices, it was a bit bumpy for the Italians at times, no question about it, but you fast forward 100 years, and many of those practices, whether it's the saints or the processions, are, as far as I can tell, venerated in most parishes. They're a vital part of parish life. As a consequence of the changing demographics of the church, we're seeing more of a focus on Our Lady of Guadalupe, Our Lady of Lavang, and Padre Pio from Italy, among others. Now, one issue that has received a fair amount of attention in recent years is that of iconography. Particularly, in other words, how does your church represent Jesus and the Virgin Mary? How is Jesus depicted in your church? How's the Virgin depicted in your church? In any event, no icon receives more attention in Western society than Jesus, the Son of God in Christian theology. And how Jesus is depicted, of course, is an intriguing sight of race, color, and representation. No pictures were made of Jesus while he was alive, writes Megan Rosenfeld, nor do any of the four Gospels describe him, so no one really knows what he looked like. Now, Jesus has often been portrayed by Western Europeans as a Northern European, a point that has been the subject of criticism in recent decades. The Christian immigrants from Europe, they brought these white images of Jesus with them when they came to the United States. And they further developed the Northern European portrayal of Jesus over here. And even today, Jesus is customarily depicted as a white man in mainstream American media, artistic, cinematic, and photographic portrayals of him. And the best known portrait of Jesus in modern times, in this country at least, I think, would be Warner Sallman's Head of Christ, which depicts Jesus in a head and shoulders pose with blue eyes, fair skin, and auburn hair. This image has been reproduced more than 500 million times on lamps, clocks, prints, plaques, buttons, stickers, bookmarks, calendars, billboards, keychains, coffee mugs, funeral cards, and church bulletins. And in the interest of full disclosure, when I was growing up, there was that picture in my bedroom. In the post-war years, the 40s and 50s, Sallman's image of Jesus was the preeminent devotional picture in U.S. homes, churches, and workplaces. Beginning in the 1960s, however, the fact that this image was all over the place, it was so ubiquitous, rendered it too common, and perhaps more importantly, the increasing ethnic and racial diversity of the American population made it less appealing to people of color and others. While Head of Christ, Sallman's Head of Christ, may symbolize Jesus to many older Americans, today there are many Jesus images symbolizing Christ with widely divergent skin tones, hair types, and facial features. African Americans regularly depict Jesus as a black man in Catholic churches and in other religious places, churches as well. In any event, people of faith seek to represent Jesus in their image as a matter of pride and a matter of relating to Christ. It has long been tradition in churches throughout the world for images of Jesus to mirror the faces of the faithful, writes Laurie Goodstein. Jesus is often depicted in Latin America as Hispanic, in Asia as Asian, and in Africa as black. In the United States, meanwhile, Afrocentrism has affected Christian worship and led to debates among clergy, the laity, and theologians about the depiction of Jesus as a white man in African American churches. Today, one finds black images of Christ in murals, statues, paintings, and stained glass windows in black churches across the country. And from the sources that I've seen, this has been particularly common in the last 15 to 20 years. Still, other African American congregations refuse to accept portrayals of Jesus as a man of color, especially those with large numbers of older people who grew up with white Jesus images in their homes, churches, Bibles, and Sunday school lesson books. Now I'd like to turn to the idea of descriptive representation as it relates to priests. In other words, does a person or should a person be from the same ethnic group as are most of his parishioners? It's a very interesting topic because if you look at the idea of descriptive representation, in other words, the importance of role models, the importance of someone who knows your culture, and if you speak a language besides English, who knows your language, who relates to you, there's a clear advantage to descriptive representation. In other words, if you have an African American parish, there's an African American pastor. Or if you have a predominantly Mexican American parish, there's a Mexican American pastor. At the same time, we've seen many examples of white pastors who have tried very hard to be culturally and linguistically sensitive to the needs of their parishioners of color. And they're revered, in many cases, by their parishioners. Now, an interesting phenomenon that's starting to develop, in part because of the priest shortage, is that we are having priests from other parts of the world, not just Europe, foreign-born priests coming here, say from Ghana, in one example that I know of, who will be ministering to parishes that are predominantly white. Like I know of a parish in suburban New York City where there's an associate pastor. I believe he's an associate. He's not the pastor, but he's an associate, and he's from Ghana, and this is a parish that's predominantly white. And in terms of his acceptance, some of the parishioners have not fully accepted him yet. When it comes to a baptism or a funeral or a wedding, they want the pastor there who happens to be a European American. But as time goes on, we hope that any pastor of color will be accepted and honored and revered by white parishioners in different parts of the country. Another thing that happens is sometimes you have a priest who might be from like a pan-ethnic group, but he's from a different subgroup. Let me explain what I mean by that. For instance, there's a pastor in El Paso, Texas, at a Catholic church there. It's almost completely Mexican and Mexican-American. He's a Cuban-American. There's, where I come from in Wisconsin, in one of the cities there, a heavily Italian-American parish. Most of the people from Italy in that parish are of Italian descent, trace their ancestry to the south of Italy. This gentleman comes, is descended from Northerners. In California, I just want to cite a few examples of places where Anglo priests have been successful, or largely successful in terms of ministering to people from different groups. In New York, Hispanics make up a majority of the Catholics in the Archdiocese of New York, which is Manhattan, the Bronx, Staten Island, and 7 counties north of the city. And 51% of the Catholics there are Hispanic. The vicar for Hispanic affairs in the Archdiocese, Bishop Iriondo, points out that the priests of the Archdiocese must show, as he puts it, openness and receptiveness to discover the new spirit if we're to be successful in ministering to the vibrant Hispanic community. Now this Bishop Iriondo, who is Basque, from Spain's Basque country, says it is crucial for the Archdiocesan priests and others to value the varied ways of celebrating the Eucharistic liturgy and other personal and national devotions. In Chicago, Father Ezekiel Sanchez, who's the director of the Office of Hispanic Catholics for the Archdiocese, laments the paucity of Hispanics in the Archdiocesan hierarchy. Even so, however, he emphatically rejects the notion that Latinos must be served by Latino priests or that Anglo pastors must be fluent in Spanish to be effective in their ministry to Spanish-speaking Catholics. Meanwhile, Cardinal Francis George, the Archbishop of Chicago, who is white, stresses the fact that he wants more Spanish-speaking Latino priests for Chicago's rapidly growing Hispanic communities. Some of the Chicago priests who have multi-ethnic parishes face a difficult challenge in terms of deferring to the religious sensibilities of Latino immigrants who favor expressive forms of worship while not antagonizing the native-born white Catholics who prefer to express their faith differently. Now in Los Angeles, there's a long tradition of ethnic outreach in the Archdiocese there. All told, 300 Anglo priests minister to the Spanish-speaking population. It is common for white pastors in many parishes to celebrate far more Spanish masses than English masses each week. Humberto Ramos, the Associate Director of Religious Education for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, notes that Anglo priests often have adapted very well to the demographic changes transforming Los Angeles and environs. Many white ecclesiastics serve parishes with sizable Latino populations and feel right at home, according to Ramos. A priest's cultural sensitivity and linguistic adeptness matter far more than his ethnic or racial background to Catholic Angelenos. One more gentleman who just comments on Anglo ecclesiastics who minister to Latino Catholics, a German-American bishop from Chicago by the name of John Mance. He says that it's a little harder at the beginning for an Anglo priest in a Hispanic parish. However, a white priest can overcome any cultural and linguistic obstacles if he genuinely listens to and cares for his parishioners. Mance reports that Latinos are accepting and supportive of white pastors who learn the Spanish language and the nuances of their culture. At the same time, he knows of warm, generous Anglo priests who speak heavily accented or broken Spanish, but whose Hispanic parishioners relate to them very well on a personal level. Interestingly, Mance notes that Latinos may view a white ecclesiastic as a neutral figure who brings together the different Hispanic subgroups in a parish. Mance, to be sure, believes that descriptive representation in the church hierarchy and at the parish level is necessary for Latinos and the other ethnic groups that comprise Catholic America. Therefore, he advocated for the appointment of a Mexican bishop in Chicago. Gustavo Garcia Sear, a Mexican-born priest, is the newest auxiliary there. As we look toward the future of Catholic America, it's a fascinating one in terms of how the demographics are changing the face of the church. Because while Anglos still comprise more than 60% of American Catholics, the American church, of course, is going to become increasingly multi-ethnic and multiracial in the coming decades. Immigrants, particularly those from Latin America, are driving this phenomenon. Experts do not expect the growth of the Catholic population in this country to abate, in part because the number of Catholic immigrants is outpacing the number of native-born Catholics who leave the church. Catholicism in the United States is going to become ever more vibrant and complex as a result of the religious traditions and forms of cultural expression that the newcomers bring with them. Despite many initiatives to recruit more minority priests, though, the demographics of the Catholic clergy are such that many parishioners of color will be ministered to by white priests in the foreseeable future. The cross-cultural outreach by Anglo priests to parishioners of color is going to play an important role in determining the future of the American church. Just a few dynamics regarding the future. It's highly likely we're going to have more foreign-born priests, many of them of color, ministering to American parishes. There's going to be more lay involvement simply because of the numbers, and that will also, in all likelihood, involve many people of color. And it's going to be interesting just to see how parishes adapt to the changing demographics, because every year we have fewer and fewer predominantly white parishes. And of course, as we discussed earlier, there are parishes with 2 major groups, some with 3 major groups, some with 4 even. And there are going to be more parishes where there are a couple of major groups of color, and white people are virtually non-existent in those parishes. There are going to be parishes where a predominantly white parish will become heavily Latino, maybe 30 or 40% Latino in over a 5 or 10 year period. These kinds of dynamics result in all kinds of outreach opportunities, even though it can be quite bumpy at times. Because, when you have a parish that's been operated the same way for a long time, parishioners have been going there, they're sometimes skeptical of and even hostile to the newcomers. We're going to see more diversity among bishops and church leaders, in part because of the pipeline effect. We have more priests of color, more people coming up through the ranks. An example of the pipeline effect, again, if I go back to Italian Americans, there was a time when Italian American Catholics would sometimes complain that there weren't enough Italian American bishops, and in recent years there have been many, many Italian American bishops, in part because you had more Italian American men going into the seminaries. Two of the three most recent past presidents of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, for instance, are Italian Americans. And finally, one issue that's going to be very important, perhaps even more important, will be about the whole idea of syncretic types of Catholicism. In other words, when people bring traditions from their own countries and they interface with what we see, as our American Catholicism, how does that play out? Looking toward the future, the interplay of race and multiculturalism in the American Catholic Church, in my opinion, provides other institutions with lessons and a model for inclusion that works well for whites and people of color. Race relations in the church are not perfect by any means. There's plenty of work to be done. Indeed, no multicultural society, institution, or community enjoys complete harmony. But in many parts of our country, the Catholic Church is one of the institutions leading the way, pointing to a future in which race will not delimit anyone's life chances, one in which all of our contributions are equally valued, respected, and honored. Thank you very much. Yes, sir. Sir? No, please, no. I was going to say now, if anyone has anything that you'd like to share, please do so.
I wonder if you could comment on the view of like Paul Jenkins. We talk about the future of Christendom coming increasingly from Africa and Asia. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the impact, possible impacts of that on the United States. A couple of possibilities come to mind. One is just at the level of aesthetics, art. I think since Vatican II, there's been a tendency towards a kind of cheerier Catholicism, banners, rainbows, suns, joy, he is risen, kind of Easter church. But a good deal of the Latin American religious aesthetic is rather different, fairly gory crucifixions and so on. I wonder if you think that the increasing browning of the American Catholic Church might lead the aesthetics in a different direction, away from the more abstract, upbeat aesthetic, and more towards a more representational, graphic, and oftentimes more Good Friday part of the sensibility or of the narrative of Christ's life. Briefly tied to that, certainly there are questions about theology. There's a suggestion that the Third World Church tends to be somewhat more conservative theologically than the United States Church and the Western European Church. Do you see the possibility that the increasing browning of the American Catholic Church, and for that matter, then the hierarchy also, even in Rome, might take the church's theology in a different direction, less towards accommodation with secular enlightenment, rationalism, and so on, and maybe more towards a sort of a reaffirmation, reconsidered reformulation, but reaffirmation of a more traditionalist theology.
Yes and yes. To both of the issues you raised. They're excellent points and very important. Yes, because the American church has shown, in my opinion, a wonderful ability to adapt and evolve in response to the new demographics, sometimes there's a bit of a lag effect. I mean, as there was, say, 100 years ago, when some of the newer immigrant groups from Southern and Eastern Europe didn't always feel completely represented, but in many cases there were national parishes developed for, say, Italians and Poles and others. Yes, with regard to the representations and so forth that you're talking about. And then also, theologically, it's a fascinating topic because I've read some of the work that you're referring to, and some observers are saying that one of the reasons that the more conservative Catholic leaders worldwide have not been particularly concerned about some of the currents in American Catholicism and Western Europe is that they realize that the numbers are on their side. If you look at like exactly what you're saying about the Catholicism of African Catholics, of Asian Catholics, Latin American Catholics, it's often more conservative than that of the Americans and the Western Europeans. And the church is growing just dramatically in Africa and in parts of Asia. So yes, theologically, it may become more conservative in response to those demographics. But also at the same time, and I don't know how this will play out, but to some extent, the wealthy nations of the North continue to contribute a disproportionate amount of the money to the church relative to their numbers. So sometimes, and I don't have all the answers, of course, but sometimes that leads to people feeling they have a sense of ownership. So it'll be interesting to see if in the coming years, as the church increases in numbers of people becoming Catholic in Africa and other parts of the developing world, but at the same time you have this group that's shrinking as a percentage of Catholics worldwide, but still contributing a lot of money, if there'll be some kind of clash of some sort there. I don't know. It'll be interesting.
Is a dangerous term. And his reason being, he argues that historically, it's very hard to find successful multicultural societies. That in fact, almost always there is a dominant group, and there are secondary groups. And that it's very rare that you have genuine mutuality and equality in multicultural societies. There is almost always a dominant secondary or tertiary groups. And that the language of multiculturalism can actually hide or cover over the fact that in the name of multiculturalism, there really is a dominant group. Do you sense any of that in the language of multiculturalism here in America as it's being used? Is this a term that, say, white America uses, but that in fact the agenda of the American church remains heavily the agenda of white, suburban, upper middle class people? Or would you disagree with Coleman's sort of warning about the language of multiculturalism?
Well, with regard to multiculturalism as a general issue, there's no question about it. There's a certain amount of tokenism that exists when people talk about it. There's no question about that. But in terms of a society genuinely becoming multicultural, I mean, we have to agree on our terms here about what constitutes multiculturalism. But we as a nation and we as a people have a rare opportunity to demonstrate compellingly to the entire world that it is possible for a large multi-ethnic nation such as ours not only to succeed, but to prosper as a result of having people from so many different groups. And I've argued in my work that there's no other, I mean, there are significant disparities and inequities that have existed and continue to exist in our society, and those are wrong, and those need to be remedied. At the same time, acknowledging that, I would argue that there's no other large multi-ethnic nation or empire in the history of the world that has provided so many opportunities for so many people from so many different groups, as is the case here in the United States. Now, that wasn't the case 40 or 50 years ago. It was the case mainly for those people from the different European groups. But we've got a lot of progress to go, but at the same time, we've made a lot of progress in the last 40 years. Now, with regard to the church, the linguistic and cultural inclusiveness of that particular institution is pretty remarkable when you consider some of our other institutions. Virtually every major church leader these days, especially those who come from areas with very diverse populations, are outspoken advocates of diversity. I mean, you have people who might, this is something that, in my opinion, seems to transcend ideology. I mean, some of the bishops and archbishops have been outspoken proponents, or in some cases, opponents of initiatives that they feel harm immigrants and people of color. And they wield a lot of influence. Like, for instance, Cardinal Roger Mahony in Los Angeles has spoken out on many issues. He's spoken out on behalf of immigrants. There was an initiative a number of years ago in California that was on the ballot to curtail affirmative action in different parts of the public sector in California with education, university admissions, contracting and hiring and so forth. He spoke out against that. There's a part of Los Angeles that is a bit whiter than the rest of the city, the San Fernando Valley, although that part of Los Angeles is now very diverse. But there was a secession movement recently. He spoke out against that to keep Los Angeles together. He's spoken out on behalf of a living wage, which is an issue of great concern to many people in Los Angeles, and so forth. And he's one example of somebody who's just been a great advocate for immigrants and people of color. But at the same time, there are many such advocates. And I don't want to leave anyone out, so I'm just citing one person. There are many such advocates. And rhetoric, of course, is important, but some people would ask the question, are we just talking about rhetoric here? What about the substance of people's actions? And if you look at, in my opinion, I'm just an observer, like anyone else, if you look at the role of church leaders, rhetoric, symbols, signs, that's an important part of how they influence people, Catholics and non-Catholics alike. And through all of, through rhetoric, signs, signal, everything, they're very inclusive in modern times. I mean, if you go back into the past, there will be some people who weren't so inclusive, but I'm talking about today. Yes, sir.
Just a couple of quick comments and a question. The first comment is, I'm a little bit confused about the statistics that you are presenting, because I recently checked the statistics about Catholics in the United States, and I found out that in 2001, at least 43% of Catholics in the country were Latinos. Mm-hmm. And today, 2005, close to 47% are Latinos, and about 10% are African Americans, Asians. So pretty much Euro-American Catholics come to be between 37 to 40%. So that's, I would like to see, perhaps where you have your statistics, mm-hmm. And because the statistics that I was reading are from the Conference of Bishops, I don't know how scientifically these are, but that's the first thing. The second is, it seems to me like we are still assuming that anybody who comes from who has an Euro-American background is white, But the situation is that there are many people who come from Latin America who consider themselves white as well, And actually, Mexican Americans in the past 20 years have begun to call themselves white as well. Now the government came up with a new category, white non-Hispanic. So that was the response. But it seems like within the church, we're still using those categories. Mm-hmm. We're still separating those who are Euro-American or just European, or those who were born in this country, and we just put on, on another whole group, those who come from different countries, Latin America, Asia, from Africa. So how can we deal with that? So that's the thing, because if we maintain using the same vocabulary, somehow we're still setting, those subgroups. Mm-hmm. And the question that I have is, did you in your research find anything about the processes of education that are taking place within the church at the level of ministerial formation, theological formation? I recently read a book, on the education of Latino theologians in the United States, and it's amazing, what's happening, issues of racism, issues of actually discomfort on the part of this white majority that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. So how is education somehow supporting the differences among different cultural groups in the United States, or how is education somehow closing the gap between those differences?
Mm-hmm. Okay. You've raised such a wonderful series of points that I'm going to try to address them as best I can. If I leave something out, please let me know. Starting with the statistics, those statistics come from a Newsweek article a couple of years ago, I think. If you've got some new data that show some slightly different demographics, there's no question about it that the trend is moving in the direction of white Anglo-American parishioners being a plurality or even a minority of American Catholics. When it will happen exactly is a matter of some discussion. And your point about race in Latin America is one that's well taken, and one that I discuss in my first book in great detail. I only use the categories simply as a shorthand because the media do so, and like white, non-Hispanic, and so forth. It's a cumbersome term. I agree with you completely, and with regard to the categories, it'd be nice if we could move beyond those, but at the same time, the government did create them in the latter part of the 1970s, and to some extent, a large extent, in many parts of our country, they've structured how people identify. So for lack of a better schema, I'm using the categories, but I'd like to live in your world where we don't have them. Now, in terms of the education in the seminaries, that's a topic about which I know very, very little. And I would assume that in keeping with the ongoing focus on inclusion that we see at virtually every level of the American Catholic Church, that's also present in the seminary system. But my focus thus far has been mainly on how parishes adapt to changing conditions, and also how priests and church leaders reach out to people, make them feel welcome. And at the same time, it's a two-way street, how the people in those parishes relate to them. So, thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your speech. It was very excellent, informative, and the questions were very helpful and informative. I'd just like to mention one book, Ethnic America by Thomas Sowell. I'm sure most people here have read it. If you haven't, please do. But I'd like to just mention very briefly, following this gentleman's comments, a little bit about my background. All four of my grandparents came over in 1900 from America, Irish Catholics. And we were told when we were growing up that we were not Anglos, we were not English, we were Celtics. And beyond that, we were told that we were Black Irish. I used to get darker. I used to work construction to put myself through college. And I used to get darker than the Italian laborers. I was in the laborers union in Boston, Italian laborers. And I would get darker than the Italian laborers because I had this melanin in my skin. It was a 3-day sail 1,000 years ago from Ireland to Spain. And there's a lot of intermarriage between the Spanish sailors and the Irish sailors. And so if you look at pictures of my great-grandparents, it looks like a Spanish family. And some of the chapels in Galway, in Western Ireland, almost look Spanish. So you're right, the European notion that Europeans are Anglo leaves out an awful lot of Europeans who don't consider themselves that. But the reason I mentioned my four grandparents is that within 100 years, through the marriage of my uncles and aunts and my brothers and sisters and my nieces and nephews and my cousins, I'm now related to every race, religion, and ethnic group in America. I met a girl the other day who was an Indian Hindu. She said, are you related to Indian Hindus? I said, no, not yet. But I assume that is going to be, that will be happening shortly. I think there's an evolution. And you can see it in the Catholic Church. You can see it in other churches, the evangelical churches, the Mormon churches, this reaching out of all peoples to get to where Martin Luther King told us we should be getting, to judge people by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. So there are questions in there, and if you pick up on any part of it, that's fine. If not, it's a comment.
Those fascinating observations. I was on a radio show in Los Angeles in January. A gentleman called in, Irish Catholic. He said on the census form, he checks other, because he did exactly what you said about the correlation between whiteness and Anglo. And I'm sure phenotypically, I'm sure he looked very white, but he said he checks others because he identified white with Anglo, English, and so forth. So he, and in terms of, we're talking about skin coloration, I'm half German, and I had a great uncle from Germany, the Aboriginal Germans as far as we know, who had olive skin and wavy hair. When he became, after they immigrated, he lived in Kansas, and at the time they had segregation on the public buses. And he had, he'd been out in the summer, And one day when he got on the bus, the white bus driver instructed him to go to the back of the bus. This was a German American. I mean, typically it looked like an Italian or Spaniard or somebody from Ireland with black hair. You might see that one. One time, I went to an African American congregation, as I do. I often attend church services. And the minister, in all seriousness, asked me at the end of the service if I were black. And I was initially puzzled, because I'm not black, but he was genuinely interested. So your anecdotes resonate.
There's one last anecdote I wanted to mention. My wife, background, she's a Methodist, so I see this intermarriage of religion too, is getting together, this ecumenical spirit. But she was Irish, English, German, and 1/16 Cherokee Indian. And a lot of the Latin Americans are not strictly European, but many of them have the Native American blood and genes. And there were tens of millions of Americans in North America. Actually, there were 2 million pure blood Native Americans in the United States, 1 million pure blood Native Americans in Canada. But there were tens of millions, if not 100 million, in North America who have some Native American blood in them. So you see this tremendous diffusion and mixture, the melting pot occurring not just in the United States, but I think you see that in Europe now too, this melting pot occurring, the phenomenon occurring. And yeah, it's an interesting.
You're very correct, sir, and it's fascinating because it's not uncommon for old stock Americans, those who are like English, Scottish, or Scots-Irish descent, to often be discussing their ancestors. They'll say, oh yes, I'm 1/8 or 1/16 or 1/32 American Indian. In the book about white males, I have a paragraph in there about a gentleman who's 1/16 Cherokee, and the rest is European. He looks Norwegian like his mother, but he identifies with and is accepted as a Cherokee. He identifies with the Cherokee population, is accepted, even holds a position in the Cherokee Nation. Oh, yes, sir.
I was driving home from Easter Mass with my family, with my daughter, who's 15 years old, actually studying at the rugby school in England. Asked me why they had about 4 weeks ago a preacher, a Baptist minister from the South, come and visit rugby, which is a very, you can imagine, it was an English boarding school. It was very proper. Everyone she wears a long dress and a suit coat, and everybody wears a, and so this Baptist preacher came, and she said he was the most interesting, through an email, speaker she had ever heard. And it was so exciting. He not only spoke, but he also conducted some sort of religious service, which they were involved in. It's an Episcopal foundation for the school. On the way back in the car from Easter Mass, she asked me why, and I thought we had a very beautiful Easter Mass. We went to 10:30 at St. Agatha's, where they have a beautiful choir, and I thought it was a beautiful service. Born in the last century, so it's all the hymns. But she said, why are the Baptists so much more excited and emotional? Because the church was filled, and the church below took the overflow. But it struck me some time ago in one of the events we had here in the church in the 21st century. One of the big divides is people who interpret or live their religion more with the mind rather than the heart. And I'm wondering whether that isn't part of one of the complications in the church today the Jesuit, whose last name is Beck. I forget his name.
Alan Figueroa.
Alan Figueroa Beck. I wrote an article that impressed me when I realized how much about it. And he said that Latin America missed all of these intellectual controversies that were taking place in Europe, these theological controversies, and developed a kind of understanding of Catholicism based on more popular piety. And so these big debates that we have between our traditionalists and our liberals, or the center, are very little interest to the Latino population from which he comes. And I think the title of the article is something like "Pox on Both of Your Houses." Because we're not interested in it. We're not interested in what's going on in these battles that are going on in people's heads. What we're interested in, we develop an understanding of piety that supersedes that and it means something to us. We're wondering whether, someone asked about the seminaries. I wonder whether the training was done in the seminaries is much more intellectual experience, and I doubt that it's different from what it was some years ago. And I'm wondering whether the preparation of clergy to deal with people who are weeping with their hearts, who are looking for a community that binds together with affect, emotion, the theology which Ken Hines teaches is off the mark for so many of the people who will, as we agree, become the majority, become the people who are really the future of the church in the United States. That's sort of a statement. An observation that you can observe on.
Yes, very definitely. I think, all of our priests, of course, go through the seminaries, and many of them are intellectuals, and many of the intellectuals are very good at pastoral work, and some of them are not. They went through the seminary program, and they did well, and enjoyed it, and so forth, but they operate a little differently. But I think that somebody can go through the seminaries and you deal with the abstraction and so forth. And if the person is motivated by love for people, as virtually every parish priest is, the person prospers. With the community. And I don't know what your personal experiences have been, but based on a lot of people I've talked to, if somebody doesn't have that kind of commitment, particularly with a parish that's changing, the person might go to a different parish, do something else. Because there's a lot of commitment required. And sometimes you're managing diversity, so to speak, in terms of mediating between two groups, and that requires some diplomatic skills.
Thank you, Dominic. I want to thank you all for coming out to hear Dominic this evening. Thank you for your comments and your questions and your observations. They help to enrich the evening. And please join me in thanking Dominic Pulero for his fine presentation this evening.